What if I told you that one of the most shocking stories of resistance in colonial Brazil took place inside a church? Dandara didn't take up arms. She didn't flee to a quilombo. She simply served dinner. And the priest who raped her never woke up. Louisiana, 1847. They found the priest face down in his own vomit, blood oozing from every opening in his body. The doctor called it cholera. But the enslaved woman scrubbing the chapel floor knew better. She knew because she'd seen him drink a poison she'd mixed with the communion wine 3 hours earlier. She knew because, as he writhed and screamed about demons, she'd stood in the doorway smiling. Her name was Sadie. She was 19, and this was just the beginning. See, what they don't tell you about revenge is how easy it becomes after the first time. How the second murder seems lighter than the first. How, by the fourth body, your hands don't even shake anymore. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Before Sadie became the ghost that haunted Magnolia Plantation, before she poisoned and stabbed her way to freedom, there was a moment that broke something inside her that could never be mended. A moment in Uma Chapel. A moment with a priest. A moment that transformed a frightened girl into something much more dangerous. If you think you've heard powerful stories, wait until you hear this one. Before they erase her name again, subscribe now, activate the bell, and come with us. Sadie pressed her forehead against the cold wooden floor of the plantation chapel, her bare skin covered in goosebumps from the December chill seeping through the cracks. Behind her, Father Montgomery's voice droned through another Latin prayer, his shadow falling across her exposed back like a judgment. "You must purge the devil from your flesh," he whispered, his breath hot against her neck. "Nakedness before God is the only path to salvation for your kind." She was 19 years old. She had been born here, raised here, beaten here. But this was something new, something that made her stomach turn with a different kind of horror. 3 times a week for the past month, the master's personal priest had summoned her to these private prayer sessions, always alone, always unclothed, always ending with his hands lingering where they shouldn't. Before we continue, if you want to hear more stories like this one that uncover the brutal truths of history, hit that like button and subscribe. You won't believe where this goes next. The other, enslaved people, knew something was wrong with Sadie. They saw it in her eyes during morning assembly, in the way she flinched when anyone approached from behind. Martha, the eldest woman in the quarters, tried to talk to her one evening as they prepared dinner in the big house kitchen. "Child, whatever that man doing to you in that chapel, you got to tell somebody," Martha said quietly, her weathered hands chopping vegetables with practiced efficiency. "Tell who?" Sadie's voice was hollow. "The master? Father Montgomery is his friend. They drink bourbon together every Sunday after services. I've seen them laughing on the porch." Martha's knife paused mid-chop. She was 62 years old and had survived things that would break most people. But even she didn't have an answer for this particular evil. The master, Henry Beaumont, was considered a progressive plantation owner by the standards of 1846. He allowed his enslaved people to marry, didn't separate families unless absolutely necessary, and only used the whip for serious infractions. His neighbors praised his Christian values, the way he ensured everyone on his property attended Sunday services. They didn't know what happened in that chapel on Wednesday and Friday nights. Sadie tried to resist once. She told Father Montgomery she was sick, that she couldn't come to evening prayers. He smiled that cold smile and reported to Master Beaumont that she was refusing religious instruction, rejecting salvation itself. This Master personally dragged her to the chapel by her hair and stood outside the door while the priest conducted his session, ensuring she couldn't escape. That night, something broke inside Sadie. Not her spirit, but something else, something deeper. She lay in her small cot in the women's quarters, staring at the ceiling while the others slept around her. Thunder rumbled in the distance and rain began to patter against the roof. She thought about her mother, sold away when Sadie was 7. She thought about her father, who she'd never known. She thought about every indignity, every cruelty, every moment of powerlessness that had defined her entire existence. And she thought about the small bottles of rat poison kept in the plantation storage shed, the ones she'd seen the master's wife use to protect her precious garden from vermin. The rain grew heavier, hammering against the quarters like angry fists. Sadie sat up slowly, careful not to wake the others. Through the small window, lightning illuminated the chapel in the distance, its white walls gleaming like bones in the darkness. She wasn't thinking about salvation anymore. She wasn't thinking about prayer or forgiveness or any of the things Father Montgomery preached about on Sundays when everyone watched. She was thinking about justice, about balance, about making the scales even in whatever way she could. Her grandmother, sold away to Alabama 10 years ago, had told her stories before she left, stories about women in Africa who knew plants, who understood which leaves could heal and which could kill, stories about ancestors who never forgot, who watched from somewhere beyond, who sometimes reached through the veil to give strength to those who needed it most. Sadie didn't know if those stories were true, but as lightning split the sky again and thunder shook the very foundations of the quarters, she decided it didn't matter. True or not, she would become what she needed to be. She would become what Father Montgomery feared most, what he saw when he closed his eyes at night and pretended his God wasn't watching what he did in that chapel. She would become the reckoning. What would you do in Sadie's position? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. The plantation's poison shed stood near the property's eastern boundary, tucked between the smokehouse and the tool storage. Most people avoided it, afraid of accidentally touching something that could kill. Sadie had been watching it for days, noting when the overseer made his rounds, when the master's wife sent for supplies, when the door was left unattended. It was a Tuesday morning when opportunity presented itself. The master and his wife had traveled to New Orleans for supplies, taking the head overseer with them. The remaining overseers were scattered across the vast property, supervising work in the cotton fields and tobacco rows. Sadie had been assigned to laundry duty, work that kept her near the big house but gave her freedom to move around the immediate grounds. She approached the shed during her water break when the other women were resting under the shade trees. The door's lock was simple, designed more to keep children out than to stop someone with real intent. She used a thin piece of wire, something she'd practiced with in secret for a week, and the mechanism clicked open. Inside, the shed smelled of chemicals and death. Bottles lined rough wooden shelves, each labeled in the master's wife's careful handwriting. Arsenic, strychnine, mercury compounds. Things meant for rats, for insects, for the constant battle against nature that every plantation fought. Sadie's hands trembled as she reached for a small brown bottle marked rat poison, pure arsenic. She'd learned about dosages from Martha, who had been forced to work as a makeshift healer on the plantation. Martha didn't know Sadie's purpose in asking, thought perhaps the girl was worried about an accidental poisoning. The old woman had explained how the smallest amounts could kill, how symptoms mimicked common illnesses, how death could come slowly or quickly, depending on the dose. Sadie slipped the bottle under her dress, secured it against her body with a strip of cloth, and relocked the shed door. Her heart hammered so loud she was certain someone would hear, but the plantation remained quiet, except for the distant sounds of work and the ever-present birds calling from the live oaks. That evening, she ground the arsenic into fine powder, using stones from the creek, working in the darkness behind the quarters while the others slept. She divided it into portions, wrapped each in small pieces of cloth, and hid them in different locations around her sleeping area. If anyone found one, they wouldn't find all of them. Father Montgomery summoned her again on Friday. The note arrived during breakfast, delivered by Samuel, the house servant who carried messages for the master. Everyone knew what these summonses meant by now, though no one spoke of it openly. They just looked away when Sadie stood up, their silence as heavy as chains. She walked to the chapel with the same measured pace as always, but today felt different. Today she carried something more than fear and humiliation. Inside her apron pocket, folded in a small square of fabric, was enough arsenic to kill 3 men. She'd learned that dosage, too, from Martha's careful explanations about treatment and symptoms. Father Montgomery was waiting inside. As always, he'd prepared the chapel with candles, had laid out his Bible on the altar, had positioned everything for his twisted ritual. He smiled when she entered, that same cold smile that made her skin crawl. "Ah, Sadie, come in, child. We have much prayer to do today." She moved toward him slowly, her hand steady, despite the fear coursing through her veins. He turned to set his Bible aside, his back to her for just a moment. It was enough. She pulled the fabric packet from her pocket, crossed to the small table where he kept his communion wine, and emptied the powder into his silver cup. The arsenic dissolved instantly, invisible in the dark liquid. "Father," she said, her voice surprisingly calm, "I brought you some fresh water from the well. Thought you might be thirsty before we begin." He turned, suspicious at first, but her face showed nothing. She'd practiced this expression for days, the perfect mask of submission. He smiled again and reached for the cup. "How thoughtful." "Yes, my throat is." "And quite dry." He drank deeply, finishing half the cup before setting it down. Sadie watched every swallow, counting them like prayers. Martha had said the symptoms would start within an hour, that he'd feel sick to his stomach first, then the pain would begin in earnest. "Now then," Father Montgomery said, moving toward her with that familiar predatory look, "let us begin our prayers." For the next 30 minutes, Sadie endured what she'd endured before, but this time was different. This time, she watched him carefully, waiting for the first signs. She saw when his face grew pale, when sweat began to bead on his forehead despite the chapel's winter chill, when his hands started to tremble during his Latin prayers. "I feel unwell," he muttered, clutching his stomach. "This session is over. Return to your quarters." Sadie left the chapel without a word, her face still maintaining that perfect mask. But inside, something fierce and hot burned in her chest. The first step was complete. Now came the waiting. By midnight, Father Montgomery was writhing in his bed in the guest house, screaming about demons and fire. The master's wife returned from New Orleans, called for the doctor from town. By dawn, the priest was dead, his body twisted in agony, his eyes wide with terror at something only he could see in those final moments. The doctor declared it a sudden illness, perhaps cholera or some other fever. No one questioned it. After all, what else could it be? The master mourned his friend with genuine tears, never suspecting that salvation had come from the most unexpected place. In the quarters, Sadie lay in her cot and stared at the ceiling. She felt no guilt, no remorse, no fear of divine judgment. She felt only a strange emptiness, and beneath it, the first stirrings of something else, the knowledge that she could do this again, that she had the power to balance the scales. What do you think happens next? Tell us in the comments. Thomas Crow was the youngest of the 3 overseers at Magnolia Plantation, but he was by far the cruelest. At 26, he'd earned his position through violence and intimidation, proving to Master Beaumont that he could extract maximum work from the enslaved population through fear alone. He carried a whip coiled at his belt like a snake, used it on anyone who moved too slowly or looked at him wrong. He also had another habit, one whispered about in the quarters, but never spoken loud enough for white ears to hear. He took women behind the cotton barn on Saturday nights, chose them like selecting fruit at market, left them broken and crying in the dirt while he whistled his way back to the overseer's house. Sadie knew his pattern. Everyone did. He favored the younger women, the ones between 15 and 25, the ones who still had fight in their eyes that he could extinguish. He'd been watching her since Father Montgomery died, his gaze lingering during roll call, his smile spreading wider each day. On a Thursday afternoon, while Sadie worked in the vegetable garden behind the big house, Thomas Crow appeared beside her without warning. His shadow fell across the freshly turned earth. "Master's wife wants fresh greens for dinner," he said, though that wasn't why he'd come. I'll help you gather them. Come with me to the far garden where the good lettuce grows." The far garden was isolated, hidden from view by tall hedgerows and a grove of pecan trees. Sadie had known this moment would come, had prepared for it. She stood slowly, brushing dirt from her hands, and nodded submissively. They walked in silence, Thomas Crow behind her, his presence like a predator tracking prey. When they reached the secluded garden, he grabbed her arm and spun her around, his breath already heavy with anticipation. "I've been patient with you, girl. Watched you grieving over that priest like he was something special, but grief time's over now." Sadie kept her eyes down, her body language defeated, but her hand slipped into her apron pocket, where she'd kept another dose of arsenic since the chapel incident, along with something else, something sharper. She'd stolen it from the kitchen 3 days ago during breakfast preparation, hidden it, wrapped in cloth. A boning knife, small and wicked, freshly sharpened by the cook that very morning. "Please, sir," she whispered, using the trembling voice they expected to hear. "I ain't well. Been sick since morning." "I don't care if you're dying." Thomas Crow laughed, reaching for her dress. "Won't take but a minute." His hands were rough, practiced in this violation, but the moment he pulled her close, Sadie's hand emerged from her pocket with the knife. She didn't hesitate, didn't think, didn't pray. She drove the blade upward into his ribs with all her strength, aiming for where Martha had once described the heart's location during a healing lesson. Thomas Crow's eyes went wide with shock. He stumbled backward, hands grasping at the knife, handle, blood spreading across his shirt in a dark bloom. He tried to speak, to call for help, but only a wet, gurgling sound emerged from his throat. Sadie had punctured something vital. She watched him fall to his knees, then onto his side, his body twitching as life drained away into the garden soil. It took less than 3 minutes for him to die, 3 minutes during which Sadie stood perfectly still, her mind strangely calm, her hands steady despite being covered in his blood. When Thomas Crow finally stopped moving, Sadie moved quickly. She pulled the knife free, wiped it clean on his shirt, and tucked it back into her apron. She couldn't leave him here, couldn't risk someone finding the body too soon. She needed time, needed confusion, needed the same mercy of misfortune that had blessed her with Father Montgomery's death. The creek ran nearby, swollen with winter rains. It was a risk, but she was past measuring risks anymore. She grabbed Thomas Crow under his arms and dragged him through the underbrush, his boots leaving trails in the soft earth that she quickly scuffed out with her feet. The creek bank was steep, muddy from recent rainfall. She rolled him into the water and watched his body sink, then bob back up, then begin drifting downstream toward the wider part that eventually connected to the bayou. With luck, he'd be found miles away, or maybe not found at all. The bayou was full of alligators and snapping turtles, creatures that didn't discriminate in their hunger. Sadie washed the blood from her hands and arms in the creek, scrubbing until her skin was raw and clean. She straightened her dress, composed her face, and walked back to the big house garden to gather the greens Thomas Crow had supposedly come to collect. When another enslaved person asked where the overseer went, she said he'd walked off toward the tobacco fields, said he'd changed his mind about the greens. That night, when Thomas Crow didn't return for supper, the master sent men to search for him. They found nothing in the garden, no sign of struggle, no blood, no body. The search continued for 3 days. On the 4th day, a fisherman 10 miles downstream found Thomas Crow's corpse caught in a logjam, bloated and partially eaten by wildlife. The master ruled it an accidental drowning, tragic but not suspicious. Young men sometimes drowned in Louisiana's waterways, overwhelmed by currents or pulled under by debris. Father Montgomery's recent death had put everyone on edge, but 2 tragedies didn't make a pattern, didn't suggest murder. In the quarters, people whispered. They whispered about Sadie, about the change in her eyes, about the way she moved through the plantation now like a ghost, silent and watching. Martha tried to talk to her again, tried to reach whatever was left of the girl she'd known. "Child, I see what's happening to you. I see what you're becoming. This path you're on, It don't end nowhere good. Sadie met Martha's eyes with a gaze that made the old woman step back. You think I care about good endings? You think any of us get those? I'm just making sure some of them get what they deserve before I'm done. And what happens when you're caught? When they figure it out? Then I die. Sadie's voice was flat, empty of fear. Same as I would have died in that chapel, or in that garden, or in any of the 100 ways they kill us slow every single day. At least this way I take some of them with me. Martha said nothing more. What could she say? In her 62 years, she'd seen too much suffering, too much injustice to argue with Sadie's logic. Sometimes the only power left was the power to choose your own destruction, and who you took with you into the darkness. Sadie returned to her cot that night and did not sleep. She stared at the ceiling and thought about who would be next. Who else wore guilt on their face like a badge? Who else needed to meet the justice that white law would never deliver? She wasn't Sadie anymore, not really. She was becoming something else, something the plantation would fear, something they would remember long after she was gone. The vengeful spirit, they would call her. The darkness that came from men who thought they owned souls as well as bodies. Drop your thoughts below on where this is headed. The third overseer's death was ruled an accident, a terrible misfortune involving a collapsed barn beam and unfortunate timing. But Master Henry Beaumont was not a stupid man. 3. Deaths in 3 months, all connected to his plantation's operations, all men of authority. The whispers had reached even his ears, carried by nervous house servants who feared something unnatural walked the grounds at night. He called a meeting of all the enslaved people on a cold March morning, assembled them in front of the big house where he stood on the porch with his remaining overseer and the local sheriff, a man named Davies who'd been bought and paid for years ago. I will say this. Once, Beaumont's voice carried across the crowd, sharp and dangerous. If anyone knows anything about these deaths, anything at all, speak now. I am a fair man, a Christian man, but I will not tolerate murder or conspiracy on my property. Silence answered him. 53 people stood in that crowd and not one spoke. They kept their eyes down, their faces blank, their bodies still as statues. Beaumont's jaw tightened with rage. Very well. If no one confesses, everyone suffers. Rations cut in. Half for the next month. Work hours extended by 2, and the next person who steps out of line for any reason will feel the lash until they cannot stand. He stormed back into the house, leaving the sheriff to dismiss the crowd. But as people dispersed, Sadie felt the sheriff's eyes on her, studying, calculating. He'd heard the whispers too, had noted which name came up most often in the slave quarter rumors that somehow always reached white ears eventually. That night, Sheriff Davies returned. To the plantation alone. He found Sadie in the quarters during evening meal, pulled her aside, while others watched with fear-filled eyes. "Walk with me, girl," he said, his hand heavy on her shoulder. "We need to talk." They walked away from the quarters toward the chapel that had stood empty since Father Montgomery's death. No one wanted to pray in that building anymore, said it felt wrong, said something dark had happened there that poisoned the very walls. Inside the chapel, Davies closed. The door behind them. The space was dim, lit only by moonlight through the windows. He circled Sadie slowly, like a hunter assessing wounded prey. "You know what I think?" His voice was conversational, almost friendly. "I think you're a smart girl. Smarter than most give you credit for, and I think you've been very busy these past months." Sadie said nothing, kept her face neutral, her breathing steady. "Here's what's going to happen," Davies continued. "You're going to confess, going to tell me exactly what you did to Father Montgomery, to Thomas Crow, to Jackson Reed, and in return I'll make sure your death is quick, hanging instead of burning. That's mercy, girl, more than you showed them." "I don't know what you're talking about, sir." Sadie's voice was small, frightened, exactly what he expected to hear. "I just work the gardens and do laundry. I ain't hurt nobody." Davies moved faster than she expected, backhanding her across the face hard enough to split her lip. She stumbled, but didn't fall, tasting blood in her mouth. "Don't lie to me," He grabbed her by the throat, slammed her against the chapel wall. "I know it was you. I can see it in your eyes, that look. You think you're some kind of avenging angel, don't you? Think you're getting justice." Sadie met his eyes, and for the first time since this all began, she smiled. It was not a kind smile, not a submissive smile. It was the smile of someone who'd already crossed every line that mattered and found freedom on the other side. "You're right," she whispered. "I killed them, every single one, and I'd do it again." Davy's face went purple with rage. His hand tightened around her throat, cutting off her air. "You think this is funny? You think this ends anyway, but with you dead?" What he didn't see was Sadie's hand moving to her pocket, didn't notice her fingers closing around the small knife she always carried now. The same knife that had killed Thomas Crow, cleaned and sharpened and ready. She drove it into Davy's side, angled upward, remembering Martha's anatomy lessons. The sheriff gasped, his grip loosening on her throat. She pulled the knife free and stabbed again and again, each thrust precise and purposeful. When he finally collapsed, she stood over him, watching the life drain from his eyes. "This ends with me free," she said to his dying body, "one way or another." But Sadie knew the truth. This couldn't continue. Eventually, they would catch her, would figure out the pattern, would make her an example that terrified every enslaved person in Louisiana. Unless she acted first, unless she changed the rules of the game entirely. She dragged Davy's body to the corner of the chapel, covered it with altar cloths, and walked back to the quarters as if nothing had happened. Her mind was racing now, planning, calculating. She had perhaps 12 hours before someone discovered the sheriff's body, before the full force of white justice descended on Magnolia Plantation. In those 12 hours, she would do what should have been done long ago. Master Henry Beaumont slept soundly that night, secure in his big house with its locked doors, and confident in his power. He did not hear the soft footsteps on his stairs at 3 in the morning, did not wake until Sadie's hand clamped over his mouth and the cold edge of her knife pressed against his throat. "Make one sound and you die," she whispered, her face inches from his. "Stay quiet and listen." Beaumont's eyes were wide with terror, all his authority and power meaningless in this moment. Sadie kept the knife steady against his jugular, feeling his pulse hammering beneath the blade. "You think you're a fair man," she said softly. "You think because you don't separate families and don't whip too often that you're somehow good. But you let Father Montgomery use me like property. You let Thomas Crow rape women behind the barn. You let Jackson Reed beat men half to death for being too slow. You've built your entire life on our suffering and called it civilization." Beaumont tried to speak, but she pressed the knife harder, drawing a thin line of blood. "I could kill you right now. Nothing would be easier, but that would be too quick, too merciful. Instead, I want you to know what it feels like to be powerless, to be afraid, to understand that your life hangs on someone else's whim." She pulled papers from her dress, documents she'd stolen from his office earlier that night, forged freedom papers she'd carefully copied from ones she'd seen years ago. She'd spent weeks preparing them, practicing the master's signature, aging the paper with tea and smoke. "You're going to sign these. Freedom papers for everyone on this plantation. You're going to date them yesterday. Going to say you had a religious awakening after Father Montgomery's death, that you've decided to free all of us as penance." "They'll never believe it," Beaumont gasped. "They'll know it was forced. Maybe. But you're going to be very convincing when you file them tomorrow morning, because if you don't, I promise you'll never have another peaceful night. I'll kill everyone you care about one by one and save you for last. Your wife, your brother in New Orleans, your precious overseer. Everyone." She wasn't bluffing. Beaumont could see that in her eyes, in the absolute conviction of someone who'd already accepted their own death and feared nothing beyond it. With trembling hands, he signed the papers. All of them. 53. Freedom documents. Each one marking the end of his plantation's workforce, the destruction of his wealth, his social standing, everything he'd built. When he finished, Sadie gathered the papers carefully and stood up, though she kept the knife pointed at him. "Tomorrow morning, you file these. You tell everyone it's your choice, your decision, and in return, I'll leave here and never come back. But if I hear you've tried to reverse this, if I hear you've harmed anyone who was freed today, I'll return, and I'll make sure your death takes days, not minutes." She left through the window she'd entered, disappeared into the pre-dawn darkness like a ghost, carrying the freedom papers that would change 53 lives forever. What do you think Beaumont does? Comment below. Master Henry Beaumont did exactly as Sadie commanded. The next morning, pale and shaking, he rode into town and filed the freedom papers with the parish clerk. The news spread like wildfire through Louisiana's planter class. Henry Beaumont, respected plantation owner and pillar of the community, had freed all his enslaved people, citing religious conviction and moral awakening. Some called him insane. Others called him treasonous to his class and race. His wife left him within a week, returning to her family in Charleston with whatever jewelry and cash she could carry. His brother cut all ties, furious at the destruction of family wealth. The remaining planters shunned him, refused him entry to their social clubs, made him a pariah in the very society he'd helped build. But the papers were legal, properly filed and witnessed. 53 people walked off Magnolia Plantation as free men and women, carrying nothing but the clothes on their backs and the impossible weight of sudden liberation. Sadie left first, before dawn on the day Beaumont filed the papers. She didn't wait for official word, didn't gather goodbyes, didn't look back at the only home she'd ever known. She walked north through the morning mist, heading toward territories where freedom meant something more than a piece of paper, where her past might not follow quite so closely. Martha caught up with her 3 miles from the plantation, the old woman moving faster than Sadie thought possible. "You think I'm letting you walk into the world alone?" Martha's voice was firm despite her labored breathing. "Child, you freed all of us. You think we don't know that. You think we don't understand what you did. I murdered 4 men," Sadie said flatly. "That's what I did. You balanced scales that'd been tipped wrong since before we was born. That's what you did." Martha took Sadie's hand, squeezed it tight. "Now come on. We got a long road ahead, and I know people up in Memphis who'll help us start fresh." Others joined them along the way. Not all 53, some had family in other parishes they wanted to find. Some had different dreams of freedom to chase. But 27 people ended up traveling together, a caravan of the newly freed heading north with Sadie at their center, whether she wanted that position or not. They traveled by night mostly, avoiding main roads and towns where slave catchers might question their papers. The documents were legal, but legal meant little when money was involved, and there was always someone willing to kidnap free black people and sell them south regardless of documentation. In Tennessee, they split into smaller groups. Safer that way, harder to track. Sadie and Martha continued to Memphis with 5 others, where Martha's contacts helped them find work and housing in the free black community near the river. Sadie used a different name now, called herself Grace Johnson, tried to bury Sadie of Magnolia Plantation somewhere in the Louisiana mud. But freedom wasn't the simple escape she'd imagined. The nightmares came every night without fail, Father Montgomery's face merging with Thomas Crow's, with Jackson Reed's, with Sheriff Davies. She woke, gasping, her hands searching for the knife she no longer carried, her mind trapped between past and present. Martha found her one evening sitting by the Mississippi River, watching the water flow past with empty eyes. "You're wondering if it was worth it," Martha said, settling beside her with a groan. "Wondering if the price you paid, the things you'd done, if they bought something real or just more pain." "Every time I close my eyes, I see them dying," Sadie whispered. "I don't feel guilty. I'd do it again, but I see them anyway, and I wonder what it means that I can kill 4 men and feel nothing but tired." "It means you survived," Martha said firmly. "It means you did what you had to do in a world that gave you no good choices. And yes, it changed you. How could it not? But change ain't the same as breaking. You're still here. We're all still here, because of you." Over the following months, Word reached them from Louisiana. Master Beaumont had fallen into debt and despair, his plantation sold to pay creditors, his reputation destroyed. He'd taken to drinking heavily, was last seen working as a common laborer in New Orleans, his former status as meaningless as the titles he'd once worn so proudly. More importantly, stories began to spread through the underground networks that connected enslaved and free black communities across the South. Stories about a woman on Magnolia Plantation who'd stood up to her oppressors, who'd made them pay for their crimes, who'd won freedom not through begging or patience, but through calculated vengeance and courage. The stories weren't entirely accurate. They grew with each telling, added supernatural elements and divine intervention, turned Sadie into something larger than human. Some versions said she'd been blessed by African spirits, that she could turn invisible, that she'd single-handedly burned the plantation to the ground. But beneath the mythology, the core message remained the same. Resistance was possible, victory was possible, and submission wasn't the only option. Sadie tried to avoid these stories, tried to fade into the anonymity of Memphis's growing free black community. She found work as a seamstress, was good with her hands and patient with detail work. She attended church on Sundays, though she never quite believed in the God they preached about, couldn't reconcile a loving deity with the world she'd experienced. But the stories found her anyway. People whispered when they thought she couldn't hear, appointed when they thought she wasn't looking. Some viewed her as a hero, others as something dangerous, a reminder of how thin the line between civilization and violence really was. On a warm evening, 2 years after leaving Louisiana, Sadie sat on the porch of the small house she shared with Martha and 2 other women from the plantation. A young girl, maybe 14, approached nervously, clearly having worked up courage for this moment. "Miss Grace," the girl said, using Sadie's chosen name, "is it true what they say? That you stood up to them? That you fought back?" Sadie studied the girl's face, saw hope and fear warring there, saw herself at that age, before everything changed. She could lie, could deny everything, could send this child away with comfortable falsehoods about patience and faith and waiting for justice. Instead, she told the truth. "It's true, I fought back. I did things that can't be undone, paid prices I'm still counting, and I won my freedom, but freedom ain't the same as peace." "Would you do it again?" the girl pressed. "If you had to choose." Sadie thought about Father Montgomery's chapel, about Thomas Crow's smile, about Sheriff Davy's hand around her throat. She thought about 53 people walking free, about Martha beside her on this porch, about the small freedoms they'd built from the ashes of the old world. "Yes," she said finally, "I'd do it again. But I'd also tell you to find another way if you can. Violence takes something from you that don't ever come back, even when it's necessary, even when it's just. So fight if you have to. Resist however you can. But don't let them turn you into something you can't live with after. Stay human, even when they treat you like you're not." The girl nodded slowly, absorbing this wisdom that was both encouragement and warning. She thanked Sadie and disappeared into the evening, leaving Sadie alone with her thoughts and the endless flow of the Mississippi carrying everything south, always. South, toward the place she'd never return. Martha came out with 2 cups of chicory coffee, handed one to Sadie without a word. They sat together in comfortable silence, 2 survivors watching the sun set over a river that had seen more history and horror than either wanted to remember. "You know what I think?" Martha said eventually. "I think you did something impossible. I think you took everything they used to control us, all that fear and powerlessness, and you turned it around, used it, against them. Won freedom not by asking nice, but by making them too afraid to keep us. That's worth something, even with the nightmares." "Maybe," Sadie said. "Or maybe I just became what they always said we were, what they used to justify keeping us enslaved. Violent, dangerous, uncivilized." "No." Martha's voice was sharp, certain. "They made you dangerous by taking away every other option. They called you uncivilized while doing things no civilized person would stomach. Don't let them twist." "The story," Don't let them make your resistance into proof of their lies. You fought back because you had to. You won because you were smarter and braver than they ever imagined possible. That's the truth, and that's what those stories really say, under all the mythology. Sadie sipped her coffee and thought about that, about stories and truth, about how history would remember these years, these struggles. She thought about the girl who'd just left, about all the young people who would hear these tales and draw strength from them, who might resist in their own ways, might survive and build something better. She would never be at peace, not completely. The ghosts would always follow her. The memories would always wake her in darkness. But she was free, and 52 others were free because of choices she'd made when choice itself seemed impossible. That was justice. Imperfect, brutal, incomplete justice, but justice nonetheless. And in a world built on the absolute denial of justice for people like her, even imperfect victories counted for something. As night fell over Memphis, Sadie Grace Johnson sat with her friend and her coffee and her hard-won freedom, and tried to believe that tomorrow might be gentler than yesterday. It was all anyone could do: survive, resist, hope, and teach the next generation to do the same. The story of the vengeful spirit of Magnolia Plantation would live on long after she was gone, growing larger and more mythical with each telling. But the real story, the one that mattered, was simpler and more profound. It was the story of one woman who refused to be destroyed, who fought back against impossible odds, and who paid the price for freedom in blood and nightmares, but counted it worth the cost. That was the story. That was the truth, and no amount of myth or legend could diminish its power. What did you think of Sadie's journey? Have you heard similar stories of resistance during this dark period of history?